Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Evolution of Jazz. Today, we're going to wrap up the swing era. We're going to finish it, and this would be everything that you need before the first exam. The first exam will be from the very beginning of class, early jazz influences, ragtime, blues, stride piano, things like that, boogie woogie. All the way through Dixieland groups, both New Orleans and Chicago, the sort of transitional period where they started to incorporate that music into larger bands, James Reese Europe, society orchestras, Paul Whiteman is the king of jazz, we talked about before, Fletcher Henderson, right? And then into the swing era and the different types of big bands. We had popular big bands. We had a whole list of them. Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, Jimmy Lunsford, Artie Shaw, Chick Webb, I believe, were the ones we specifically spent time on. There was also the artistic band. The one and only one we spent a lot of time on was Duke Ellington. And so today we're going to spend our time on that last category, which is the improvisational based bands. These bands, the majority of their music was more spontaneous and built around great soloists and good improvisation. And then we're going to talk about some vocalists during the swing era briefly, just touching on a couple. And then we will kind of talk about the demise of the swing era, and that's it. Okay. So there are lots of bands that worked in this improvisational mold, but the biggest and most popular and most legendary by far would have been the Count Basie band. So Basie was a piano player. He came from New Jersey, moved out to Kansas City, and he started at the time playing with a group led by Jay McShann, which was also sort of very much an improvisational band. Basie then started to put his own band together. Later on, their home base was New York City, and just like I had mentioned with Duke Ellington, after the swing era sort of ends and all those popular bands kind of go away, Duke Ellington's band was able to continue because Duke Ellington composed new music and sort of adapted to the times. The Basie band was able to keep going, and it was arguably the most popular band of the 40s and 50s because of the level of improvisation and the skill. Jazz is going to become, after the swing era and all this sort of pop music, it's going to become an improviser's art form. And that's where the focus is going to be. So Count Basie's band was full of great improvisers. So that was one of the main reasons they were able to continue doing what they were doing. Even though it was more expensive to keep a band on the road, a band of maybe 15 or 16 pieces, the Basie band was able to do it. Okay? They were the best swinging band around here, known for its great swinging style, and again, the leading band of the 50s and 60s. Okay, so let's get down to some of the nitty gritty here. You're going to see some of this in the video as well, so it's a little bit redundant, but again, I just want to really drive home some of these important facts about them. As far as big bands go, the Basie band rhythm section was the best ever. You're going to hear the same sort of thing when we're talking about small groups later on, but this was big bands. And the Basie big band with Basie himself on the piano, Walter Page, known as Biggin, on bass, Joe Jones playing the drums, and Freddie Green playing guitar, was the swingingest, best, most solid rhythm section in the history of big bands. Freddie Green sort of set the he established what a rhythm guitar player was in jazz. He played, as you can see, 46 years with the Basie band, never played a solo. His job was very much like a piano, and it's providing the harmonic foundation, the chord structure. And so he was very, very steady. I direct the jazz band here at the college, and I have seen a lot of the charts that I pass out for the band to play. It'll actually say in the guitar part, a la Freddie Green. They want you to play just like Freddie Green in a Freddie Green style. It's that well known. They had a great sense of tempo, very relaxed. Didn't matter what speed. If it was slow, it was right in the pocket and grooving slow. If it was just lightning fast, terrifyingly fast, it was still smooth and effortless in a sense. And most groups can't say that. So the Basie band's rhythm section was really one of a kind. As you will also see in some of these videos here, the Basie band, what makes improvisational bands different than pop bands in particular is that all those pop band charts where they would play arrangements, they'd have music written down, and the tunes were about 3.5 minutes long, and every single night they played them, they're 3.5 minutes long. I uploaded tunes like I'm Getting Sentimental Over You, or In the Mood, or Begin the Begin by the Artie Shaw Group. Every single time they played those songs in a concert, and I can't guarantee every single time, but the majority of the times that they played them just like the record. And if you had a soloist playing maybe one chorus, then every single night that soloist played one chorus. And they got to improvise a little bit, but it was really a fixed amount of time. Okay, so the tune was always a certain length. It was always 3.5 minutes long, give or take. The Basie band is different, where instead of 90% of it written out, 10% of it improvised, like those pop bands, this is the opposite. It's 90% of it improvised and 10% of it figured out in advance. A lot of these charts were never written down at all, actually, by the group. They sort of created them communally. When you're playing a saxophone solo, we'll play this behind you, right, to support you and that kind of stuff. And to do that, they had to work in forms that everybody recognized, particularly the 12-bar blues and the 32-bar standard American song form, as long as everybody knew what the chord structure was. So if it was a well-known chord progression, they could work. Everyone in the band could work like that too. Again, without actually reading music. Okay. So the types of tunes that we're talking about here, and then I'm going to share with you a few Basie examples, is there would be these tunes called riff tunes, which are basically they'd come up with a riff or a lick or a groovy sounding passage, and then they would repeat that riff over and over again, and then they would start to build other things on top of it. It's oftentimes built on a 12-bar blues, not necessarily a melody that you would hum along with, more like a riff, a short little figure. And then that's just, again, repeated over and over again to set the tone and the character and all that kind of stuff. Then as soloists, members of the band start to improvise, other members of the group add other riffs behind him or behind a particular soloist. Very flexible, could go all night long. Again, the pop bands are playing kind of the same tunes night after night after night. In the Count Basie band and other improvisationally based bands, if one of the soloists, if a tenor saxophone player, if Lester Young is just tearing it up on the saxophone and he doesn't want to stop, they don't have to stop. They can just keep going and he can keep playing, and they could play 1, 2, 3, 10, 12 choruses, and they could just keep adding different riffs behind him to keep the momentum going. And if he's, killing it and the rhythm section's grooving and the band sounds great, it could just keep going. So on record, a Basie band tune might sound 3 minutes long. That is because in the early days, before long playing records, they had 78s, which allowed you to play basically one song per side. So there was a time limit. It had to be between 3 and 4.5 minutes long. So on record, it might be a 3.5 minute tune. But in the club that night, if everyone's grooving, that might be a 20-minute song, because there might be 10 soloists and they get into a little bit of a good-natured battle trying to one-up each other, right? And so the tune could just go on and on and on. If people were dancing and the band was grooving, there's no reason to stop it, right? Can't really capture that on record yet, again, because the records aren't long enough. But that's one of the big differences between the pop bands that played arrangements that were always kind of stock and the same. It's always going to be the same every night we play it, outside of a short solo here and there. The Basie band, it's the total opposite. This could be completely different night after night, depending on who's soloing, how long they're going to solo, right? So it's really exciting music to participate in and to witness, okay? A similar tune would be known as head arrangements, where they would have the head is the top, right? So they'd have a head or the basic melody that would be used at the top, and then a chord structure to support that melody. And then they would build the tune around the head. And then again, they would open it up for solos, and they would have other riffs and other figures added behind the soloist at that time. And again, very flexible, can be opened up and just go on and on and on and on and on, right? Early on, the Basie band didn't use written music. They just played like this, very much in a sense of like a jam band, okay? Later on in the 50s and 60s, they started to play written arrangements. They had really, really well-known arrangers, Sammy Nestico, Bill Holman, Neil Hefti here, who wrote and arranged really great songs specifically for the Basie band. Even though those tunes are arranged and they're on paper, you know, everyone's playing the notes on the paper, there would still be sections that would be wide open for soloists. So again, they still very much are in the Basie tradition where people can improvise as long as they want to, as long as it's going well, right? So that's kind of how the Basie band and other improvisational bands differ from the pop bands of Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, and the like, and in a lot of ways from Ellington's band as well. This is just wide open stuff. And again, the excitement of that is really great to witness. Full disclosure, this is my favorite big band stuff. I got a giant soft spot for the Count Basie band, and particularly the later Basie band stuff, the 1950s and 60s stuff. It was amazing sounding. And I'm going to share one particular clip with you, or one particular song with you to you can hear how great the band sounds. I mean, it's amazing. Okay, so the Basie band was based in Kansas City early on, right? And again, as you'll see from the video, a lot of musicians traveled to Kansas City, so it allowed for them to join these groups that were almost purely improvisation and let them hone their skills. You will see this progression going forward after the swing era. It's not about, can I sit down and play the notes anymore? Jazz is going to become, can I sit down and how inventive can I be, and how challenging can these chord changes be? How can I navigate these really hard chord changes? Can I outplay that other person? It's really going to become sort of a competition. And the very best improvisers and the people who are creating the most challenging music, they're going to rise to the top and be the big stars. Unfortunately, as the music gets more complicated to play, it also gets more complicated to listen to. And so jazz is actually going to lose a fair amount of fans to rhythm and blues and other forms of music after the swing era, just because jazz is going to get really, really complex. But that's how it works. So again, starting in Kansas City, that's where Basie forms the band. They can all play the blues. They can all do this kind of stuff. These great improvisers are going to influence the next generation, particularly saxophone players like Charlie Parker, who we will pick up with on Monday when we start talking about bebop. And then, of course, they move to New York eventually. John Hammond is there, the promoter, the jazz aficionado, right? He gets the band a regular working gig at the club called the Famous Door after he pays for the air conditioning. They actually took part in the second ever Battle of the Bands at the Savoy Ballroom. The first was Chick Webb and Benny Goodman. The second was Chick Webb and Count Basie, right? And history, that was a divided audience. Basically, they didn't know who was who, or they didn't know who won exactly. Okay, so I uploaded a couple of tunes for you and a short video explaining how they would play these tunes, like all as improvisation. So I uploaded the song 1 O'Clock Jump, which was basically their theme song. And then I uploaded a short YouTube video that I use in other classes that walks you through the 12-bar blues and that song, and how it's basically 10 choruses of solos. It starts with Basie playing the piano for 2 choruses, 2 times through the blues. And then there's a tenor sax solo, and then there's a trombone solo, then there's a trumpet solo, I think, and then there's another tenor sax solo, and then back to Basie. And it's just a never-ending flow of solos. And that is a really good example of like a riff tune, where they kind of start with a boogie woogie piano, and then as soon as people start soloing, they start adding these riffs behind them. Okay, so please check that video out. I also added another great tune called Doggin' Around, which is very similar in style. Then actually, I think that's it. I think that's all I put up for the Basie band in particular. Okay, I did add a few more examples, but we'll talk about those as we move into some other things. So go listen to the Basie Band. Just a couple of examples. We could do a year-long class on the Basie Band. It would be so great, but there's no time. So go check out the 2 Basie Band examples and watch the 12-bar blues video that coincides with 1 O'Clock Jump, and I hope that'll help make sense of how bands like this would implement the blues. Okay, so go check those out and come back. Go. All right. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, that's some of my favorite stuff. So that pretty much is the 3 types of bands. There was the pop bands that we listed off in a previous video. There was Duke Ellington as the artistic band, and now there was Count Basie as our one example of improvisational bands. There were more bands, many, many more, and they could be put in these different categories or sort of cross categories sometimes. Basie's band would play pop tunes too, because pop tunes pay the bills, but they would also be this great improvisational band as well. Okay. All these bands typically had singers with them. You saw a little bit of that earlier with Tex Beneke and the Modern Airs, with the Glenn Miller Band, for example. Even the Basie Band would tour with singers because, again, they would play occasional pop tunes. Ellington's band would have singers, particularly Ivy Anderson for many years, who was famous for singing "It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing," right? So vocalists will sort of some vocalists will become quite famous during the swing era. And then again, after the swing era ends, the vocalists still remain big stars. While the bands disappear, some of the vocalists, like the 3 we're going to talk about here, actually continued very much into superstardom later. Some of them, Billie Holiday in particular, died tragically fairly early. But after the excitement and the popularity of like Benny Goodman being the king of swing, and Tommy Dorsey, and all these people, their star wanes, but the singers continue. Okay, so I've uploaded a couple tunes for each of the singers here, and let's just go through these. There's also a video clip that sort of helps, I think, introduce this stuff pretty well also. So there was Billie Holiday, who toured with the Count Basie Band, toured with Artie Shaw, which was a white band. Billie Holiday herself was black. Artie Shaw tried to integrate the group using Billie Holiday, those sorts of things, right? She had a nickname. It was called Lady Day. Billie Holiday had a very rough life and a lot of sort of demons and issues with substance abuse and whatever. She smoked quite a bit. She drank substantially. She used a lot of drugs. It took its toll on her voice. If you listen to early Billie Holiday, her voice is a little bit lighter and more flexible. Late Billie Holiday, her voice sounds like she's been smoking and drinking for 40 years. All that aside, she is considered by jazz musicians to be one of the most influential jazz artists ever. And quite frankly, most people would say she was the greatest ever jazz vocalist, particularly female jazz vocalist. She had this way to sing a melody that was very new, that was very fresh, similar to Louis Armstrong, where he would sort of break it down to just the most essential notes. Billie Holiday would do that. Billie Holiday did not improvise in a traditional way. She did not scat sing or anything like that. But the timing, the way she would interpret a melody, particularly rhythmically, was very inventive, and that is part of her long-lasting influence on the music. Okay, she had a limited vocal range. Like most mortals, it was only about an octave and a half. Trained singers can usually sing much more than that, but it was just a very limited range, so she had to be careful with her note selection. In addition to being this great singer and interpreter of songs, she composed some songs that became sort of standards in the repertoire, particularly a tune called "God Bless the Child." As I mentioned, she did tour with bands, but eventually she got that gig at the Cafe Society in New York, where she stopped touring and she just sort of had a home base and stayed there. Unfortunately, again, with her problems with drug use and things like that, she lost her cabaret card, which didn't allow her to perform much. She She actually was arrested numerous times. She spent her last days in the hospital. Actually under arrest. There was a cop like outside the door. It was kind of a tragic situation for Billie Holiday. But one of the most influential singers of all time. I put up 2 songs for you. I put up Strange Fruit in its entirety. And I also put up another one that I can't remember right now. A Fine Romance. I put up a version of her singing A Fine Romance, just to give you a taste of Billie Holiday's style and things like that. So go listen to the 2 Billie Holiday tunes, and then come back for a few more singers. Go. Okay, next would be Ella Fitzgerald, known as the First Lady of Song. As you'll see in the video, if you haven't already, it was difficult for her to catch on with big bands because the trend was for very attractive singers, and Ella Fitzgerald was not the most attractive young lady to some of the audience at that time. However, she did catch on with Chick Webb's band and recorded a number of very, very popular songs. I've uploaded the tune A Tisket, A Tasket in its entirety. It's the same one that you get in the video. Okay. After Chick Webb passed away, it became Ella Fitzgerald and her orchestra, and she continued to be very, very popular up until the very end of her days. Unlike Billie Holiday, she had this light, girlish voice that she maintained throughout her whole life. She had a very wide vocal range, could sing very low, could sing very high. And she actually evolved in new styles. When the swing era ended and pop tunes sort of became less of a thing, she evolved and became focused on becoming a really good improviser, and could do that in scat singing. I'm going to upload a clip of her singing actually the one-note samba, and she sings the one-note samba, scatting, it's one note, right? And then after she goes through the one-note samba, then she starts to improvise, and she's all over the place, that kind of stuff. It's really quite virtuosic and challenging, and it's happening in the moment. She knows the chord changes, she knows where she needs to go. It's really quite impressive. So by all means, check out both of those things. Check out the version of A Tisket and a Tasket, and go check out her scat singing. It's really quite amazing. And then come back for one more singer. Go! Okay, our last singer, we'll pick one male singer, and that'll be Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra had a bunch of nicknames: Chairman of the Board, Old Blue Eyes, things like that. He grew up in New Jersey, singing in talent shows and small groups and trying to catch on with groups. He eventually caught on with the Harry James Orchestra. Harry James was a trumpet player in Benny Goodman's band, and then he started his own band. And then after his work with Harry James, he moved up to the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. And after that, he became a soloist. As a young man, his voice is very light and clean. Later years, it becomes a little more brusque, again from scotch and cigarettes, basically. Unlike Ella Fitzgerald, and more like Billie Holiday, Frank Sinatra didn't improvise. He didn't scat sing. But again, it's really more about his interpretation of the songs, his sense of timing when singing the songs, the degree of swing, that kind of stuff. That makes him more of a jazz singer. Now, in the case of Frank Sinatra, everybody regards him as a jazz singer because he sang with jazz bands. That's how he got his start, and again, kind of his sense of timing and that kind of stuff. But you could also consider Frank Sinatra to be really just a pop singer, because he didn't write his own music. All he did was sing pop tunes. But even though he happened to sing them early in his career with a big band, and oftentimes later in his career as well. So he's not really a jazz musician per se. Really just a pop singer, but it happens to be considered a jazz singer for a lot of those reasons. Later in his career, 50s and 60s, he sang in Vegas. He was a big act, a big draw in sort of early Las Vegas. He was a member of the Rat Pack, which was a group of singers and actors: Dean Martin, Joey Bishop, Peter Lawford and Sammy Davis Jr. There's this fantastic album actually recorded at the Sands Casino, which no longer exists, but it was Sinatra with Count Basie from this era, from the 50s. I've actually uploaded a tune, Fly Me to the Moon, which is from that album. It's Sinatra at the Sands with Count Basie. So you'll hear the Basie Band in its 1950s form, which sounds fantastic, and you'll hear Sinatra, who sounds fantastic. So by all means, go check that out. In addition to being obviously a great sort of singer, Frank Sinatra was sort of more of an entertainer in the sense that he was also an actor. He actually won an Academy Award for the movie From Here to Eternity. He was nominated again for Best Actor in The Man with the Golden Arm, but did not win. Earned a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Screen Actors Guild. So Frank Sinatra was very much multifaceted entertainer. So go check out the Sinatra with the Basie Big Band on Fly Me to the Moon, and then come back and we will wrap up the swing era. Go! Okay. I hope you enjoyed some of those tunes. So the swing era ends after World War II, and there's a lot of factors that are involved. I want to talk about some of the business labor issues. Of course, tastes change, right, and styles of music coming in out of style. I think a big part of this that is often not talked about is the fact that the big band era was the swing music was like the soundtrack to World War II. And when the war was over, I think a lot of people would not want to listen to the music that would remind them of a world war, So I think that's part of it too. But from the labor side of things, a lot of top dance bands had to break up entirely or break into smaller groups that so everyone could get paid. There's a style of rhythm and blues called jump blues that was basically went from like a 15-piece jazz band down to like a 7-piece rhythm and blues band, a couple of horns and a rhythm section and a singer, singing early rhythm and blues tunes. So a lot of things had to happen here. From the labor side, other than just paying everybody, here's some factors that you should know about, okay? For example, there was an organization called the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, which has the acronym ASCAP. ASCAP was an organization for songwriters, and it was a way to kind of ensure sort of getting some royalty payments and things of that nature. Any place that broadcasts music, like radio stations and things like that, or theaters that would have groups play live music, they would have to pay a fee to ASCAP, and then ASCAP would divide up that money and send it out to the composers whose music was played in the theaters or broadcast over the radio. That's it in a nutshell. It's much more complicated than that, but that's basically the point. Well, ASCAP was started in 1914, before radio. And so when radio started in 1920 and then exploded very rapidly over the 20s, it started playing more and more music, particularly swing music, because by the late 30s and 40s, it was the swing era. They're playing a tremendous amount of swing music. Well, ASCAP, the organization ASCAP went to the radio networks and said, listen, you are making a tremendous amount of revenue, advertising revenue and whatnot, off of the music of our composers. Now this really affected like the pop bands, because the pop bands played a lot of pop tunes. So they'd play jazz arrangements of songs by Tin Pan Alley songwriters like Irving Berlin or Vernon Duke or Cole Porter. The song Begin the Beguine, by the version I gave you by Artie Shaw, that was written by a Tin Pan Alley song composer, Cole Porter. Cole Porter, as a Tin Pan Alley songwriter, would have been a member of ASCAP, for example. Okay, so ASCAP goes to the radio networks and says, "Hey, we need to redo this contract. You need to pay us a lot more money because you're profiting a tremendous amount off of the product of our songwriters, right?" The radio networks basically said, no way, screw you, we're not going to do that. And they actually, in 1940, formed a rival agency called BMI, or Broadcast Music Incorporated. ASCAP was closed to everybody except Tin Pan Alley popular song composers. BMI, on the other hand, opened the doors to other types of music and allowed other composers of other sorts of music to get royalty payments, particularly country and western artists, and rhythm and blues artists, right? Some radio stations even changed programming so they would not have to deal with ASCAP. So they went from maybe playing pop music by swing bands and pop music composers, and they switched to a country channel, right? So then they wouldn't have to, they could work with BMI instead of ASCAP, for example. So BMI allowed songwriters outside of Tin Pan Alley to collect royalties, all right? Boosting country and western and rhythm and blues at the expense of jazz, all right? Well, to sort of fight back, in 1941, ASCAP called a strike, saying, withdrawing the rights to broadcast any of the material of their members. Now, this hurt the jazz bands a fair amount, popular bands, because if they relied heavily on music by ASCAP-affiliated composers, that music was no longer going to be broadcast over the radio. So you could make a brand new record of a version of a song by George Gershwin, but it's not going to get broadcast. Again, eventually hurting the bands themselves. Now, this didn't affect Count Basie's band because all their tunes are based on improvisation and not written by ASCAP-affiliated composers. And it's not going to affect Duke Ellington's band because Ellington wrote all of his own music. This only affected the pop bands that used a lot of pop song material, okay? And like I said, those were the bands that kind of disappeared after the swing era, all right? You also have, in 1942, the American Federation of Musicians, known as the AFM, they also called a strike against the recording companies because up until this era here, up until 1942, if you were a musician and you played on a record, you got a per service fee. So you came in, here's $25, you're gonna play on this record. Thanks for coming. Good job, right? If the record bombed, well, no big deal, you made $25. If the record became a smashing success and the record company made millions of dollars off this record, you still made $25, and that was your pay. Well, ASCAP had been providing some amount of royalties, essentially like a security blanket in a sense, to the composers of the songs. So since 1914 up until the early 1940s, the songwriters had been getting residual royalty payments, but the musicians had not. So the American Federation of Musicians finally said, hey, that's not cool. You got to pay us more. We need some sort of system, some royalty system. The recording companies, again, said, no way, not going to happen. So the American Federation of Musicians went on strike. And now no music was recorded by the bands that were union members. Again, sort of hurting the bands in a sense. In the end, that strike and the ASCAP strike and the AFM strike would put a lot of these dance bands, a lot of these dance musicians out of work. This is the early 40s. Things would hang on again until sort of the late 40s or mid 40s. But this allowed for rhythm and blues to make more headway into popular music. It allowed for country and western to make more headway. It also allowed the singers like Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald to get a few legs up because singers were not members of the musicians union. Only the instrumentalists were. So these are some of the business factors that actually perhaps accelerated or at least helped lead to the demise of the big band era, in addition to just changing tastes and things like that. All right. That's it, folks. That's the end of all the material for your first test. So use the study guide to prepare. Use those film worksheets to prepare. Review any material that you need to. And I will put up all the testing information on Moodle for you, okay? We will start our next material on the stuff that comes after the swing era, particularly bebop. One thing you may want to keep in mind or may want to be aware of is that the exams are not comprehensive. So this exam will be the earliest influences of jazz to the swing era, and after that you can kind of put that away. And then the next one will be bebop to kind of like a hard bop. It'll cover a bunch of different things: bebop, cool, modal, third stream, hard bop. It'll be that stuff, and then you can kind of put that away. And then we'll have a final exam that will again not be comprehensive. Okay, so I hope that helps. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Okay, thanks for tuning in and sticking with me, and I will see you guys next time. All right.